Great to see you. Great to have you on. Appreciate you joining. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you guys?
Doing fantastic. First of all, before we get into UC's training camp and everything over at Camp Higher Ground and how the season's going so far, you wrote a great article back from the middle of July about conference realignment and how UC positioned themselves this time around as opposed to back in 2013. If you haven't read the article, if you're listening right now, go and read it. It's fantastic. But can you just talk a little bit more about what you wrote in that article and how UC has gotten to this point, and where they sit right now going into the Big 12, especially as you look at it from the lens of what's happened in the last 5 or 6 days in college football?
Yeah, I was going to say it's particularly relevant now, right? Because, what is happening right now to Oregon State and Washington State and Cal and Stanford in the Pac-12, that's what happened to Cincinnati, a dozen years ago when they were in the Big East. And it's if you think back, Cincinnati fans know this, but if you're just kind of a casual college football fan, Cincinnati was competing at the top of college football in 2008, 2009. They went to back-to-back BCS bowls when they were part of the old Big East. They were very close to going to a national championship actually in one of those years if a couple things had kind of swung in their favor. And then the Big East falls apart, and Cincinnati's kind of one of those very few schools that was left on the outside looking in. It happened to UConn at the time. It happened earlier when the old Southwest Conference shut down for places like Houston and TCU and things like that. And so for Cincinnati, they were, competing with or better than all of their kind of automatic qualifying peers during the BCS stint there in the late 2000, early 2010s. But they realized they weren't making the investments in their athletic department and their facilities that they needed to compete with places like Louisville, who got one of the last spots in the ACC, or TCU, who kind of worked their way back up through the Mountain West and then into the Big 12, and Utah going to the Pac-12. So really, they kind of had to take this leap of faith, and it's a credit to Cincinnati, board of trustees, athletic directors, presidents who invested in the university, whether it was renovating Nippert Stadium, renovating Fifth Third Arena, the basketball arena, but also just kind of all these efforts they were making behind the scenes to try and get the program back to that power conference level that they were at in the Big East. And there were certainly some times where it looked like it wasn't going to happen for them. People remember in 2016, the Big 12, looked at doing another round of realignment, and Cincinnati was kind of viewed as one of the top prospects in that. And the Big 12 ended up deciding to stay put. They weren't going to add. And I really think after that, it felt like dark days a lot of times for Bearcats fans and for certainly people involved in the university and stakeholders. But there was always this belief that if the next round of realignment happened, Cincinnati had to be ready, had to position itself. And in some ways they got lucky, because when it happened, Luke Fickell was there, and the team had gone to a New Year's Eve bowl, and they were in the playoff race, ended up making the playoff. And so in that sense, you can kind of look from the outside and be like, well, it kind of just fell into Cincinnati's lap. The Big 12 needed some teams. They were the best group of 5 team at that time. But I think if you read that story and kind of look at the history, it's really the 12 years of work, 10 years of work that led up to that moment that allowed them to be in that position to get the invite and for things to work out. And now with all this next round of realignment that's happening, the Big 12 seems to be in a really good, stable spot, and Cincinnati's part of that going forward. And so it shows just kind of how quickly in college athletics, how much your fate can change.
I want to go back to something you talked about from 2016, where it looked like UC was going to be in the Big 12. Everybody remembers the banners, the backdrop being printed out and everything, the Enquirer and everybody else. That it seemed like a done deal. And then to get from that point to now, where you're going to play in the Big 12, you're going to have Oklahoma come up here to Nippert Stadium, you're going to travel to Allen Fieldhouse in basketball. It seems like UC had to go and kind of look in the mirror. Were there specific things between 16 and 20? When was it announced? 2019, 2020, when they announced that they're 20. Okay, 20. God, it all runs together, Justin. It all runs together after COVID. When they announced that they were going to join the Big 12, that was it one specific thing that you felt like changed, or was it a collection of things? Can you just talk about that a little more, like what you just mentioned?
Yeah, the Fifth Third arena renovation was after that 2016 as well, and I think that was another example of they put a bunch of money into Nippert Stadium, almost $90 million, and then they realized, all right, even though we didn't get in 2016, we need to keep going forward. We have to be ready, and so Fifth Third to put another 90 million into that, I mean, that's a big ask, and they were able to do that. But also just in general, it was the investment in football. They made the right hire in Luke Fickell, and that obviously worked out, but we had seen a history of Cincinnati coaches coming in, having success for a couple of years, Mark D'Antonio, Brian Kelly, Butch Jones, and then moving on to a bigger job. Luke Fickell absolutely had those opportunities starting after his second season. There were places calling and trying to get him. And to Cincinnati's credit, they made the necessary investments to keep Luke Fickell, to increase his salary pool for assistant coaches, to just generally increase the resources that were involved in football. And eventually, we got to what we're seeing now with, they've unveiled plans for a $134 million indoor practice facility. The Big 12, certainly helped with that, but they were working on those, plans and ideas even before the Big 12 became a reality. And so there was an understanding that football drives the bus with realignment. And once they realized they had the right coach in Luke Fickell, they did everything they could to keep him there as long as possible. Obviously, he just, this past offseason left and went to Wisconsin, but he stayed 6 years, which is an eternity for Cincinnati football coaches over the past couple of decades. And he was a big part of getting them to where they are right now.
What's your take overall? Because you're somebody that's in it, you talk to these guys, especially where UC is now settled. And I think the biggest thing with conference realignment, at least from an outsider's perspective, is that it feels like all of these schools try to be on the leading edge of it, right? Nobody wants to get left behind. Everybody wants to make sure that they are putting their best foot forward before anybody else to make sure that you're not ending up like Washington State or one of these schools that now seem to be on the outside looking in. Cal, Stanford, although I don't know how much they particularly care right now or their fan base cares. That Stanford, for as much tradition and history as they have had, a lot of that now, especially you look at Cal basketball and a lot of those athletics that have shifted in the last few years. But to see the Pac-12 and all of its history disintegrate in a matter of hours like this, what is your take overall as somebody that talks to, these decision makers and everything? What's your overall take on conference realignment in this past week?
Yeah, I mean, I think we saw a good example. So we're, just over a week removed from Colorado jumping to the Big 12, right? And that was kind of the first. Obviously, go back to Texas and Oklahoma, USC and UCLA. That started this whole wave. But things had kind of settled. The Pac-12 was struggling to get a TV deal together. Once Colorado jumped to the Big 12, though, which I think was July 27th, then everyone kind of enters that, a little bit of a panic mode that you referenced, because you do not want to be the one that gets left behind. And so if you're a team that was like, no, we want to stick in the Pac-12, we have a lot of history here, people forget presidents make these decisions, of universities, not just athletic directors or coaches or things like that. The presidents care about the academics and the history and tradition. And so there's always this kind of hesitancy to make these big moves until someone else does it first, and then that possibility of you getting left out and left behind starts to, become more and more real. That is why I think we then saw the dominoes fall really quick last week, with basically the Pac-12 completely falling apart. And, from a fan perspective, there's been a lot talked and written about this. I don't think anyone likes this. No one is excited about the Pac-12 falling apart, or these, we're kind of moving towards, it seems like, this super conference future in college football, or college football breaking off from the other, college sports and things like that. 9 out of 10 fans are going to be against that probably. But if you're talking about the people that are making the decisions or involved in this, more money from TV contracts or whatever is always a pull, but even more motivating than getting more money is the fear of being one of those schools that's not, of getting left behind. And I think that's why once someone makes that first move, that's why you see a bunch of other teams kind of, fall in line, or a bunch of other dominoes fall behind that, because you don't want to be what Cincinnati was 12 years ago. You don't want to be what it looks like Washington State, Oregon State, those schools might be right now.
Well, and it's got to be frustrating too when you're looking at this and you're saying to yourself, all right, is the NCAA or is college football, at least, is it just going to basically become a JV version of the NFL? Because you were already kind of trending that way. You had the SEC, you have all these national champions that are dominated by one league for the last decade plus. You sprinkle in LSU, you sprinkle in, but even, LSU, SEC, you sprinkle in a couple of Clemsons and Ohio State back in 2014. But for the most part, this is a sport dominated by one conference. And now all of a sudden you're creating this nationwide aspect of this sport where you're losing the geographical rivalries and everything else. Do you think in the long run that matters for the health of this sport? Because college football is built on tradition and rivalry and everything else, and you know, Washington State fans taking their flag to college game day all over the country, and those types of things that you don't get in the NFL. Do you think that college football is at a breaking point right now, and they're really at a critical juncture for the sport?
I definitely think the soul of the sport is, you know, kind of getting sucked away. And honestly, that's been happening over the past couple decades. You know, we saw that with that last round of realignment back in the early 2010s when Rutgers and Maryland and Nebraska are going to the Big Ten, and that had a huge impact. But you're definitely seeing it now where you're kind of losing the regional conferences. You're losing a lot of longstanding rivalries. You know, Oklahoma State and Oklahoma, who knows after this year the next time they're going to play each other in the Bedlam rivalry. That seems ridiculous to anybody who would be a fan of those teams or of Big 12 teams in general. But to your question of like, is it at a breaking point? I don't know, because I know what all these TV executives and you know, broadcast partners are looking at, which is they're looking at what the ratings are when Ohio State plays Oregon or when Texas plays Alabama or Georgia. People are going to watch. And, you know, you mentioned the JV NFL. I don't think anyone who kind of loves the history and tradition and uniqueness and peculiarities of college football, no one wants that. But the only thing that people in America watch more than college football is NFL football on TV. So you're right. It's definitely kind of losing things that make it special. And maybe in the long run, we do see a debilitating effect in terms of, you know, younger fans or alumni connections to universities and things like that. But I also think that probably in 5 or 10 years, the ratings for these games are going to be better than ever, you know, from a TV standpoint. And unfortunately, that's what's kind of driving all these decisions. And I think that's what's going to continue pushing us towards this power conference future, whatever that might look like.
All right, let's talk about UC right now out there at Camp Higher Ground. How much longer are they going to be out there, Justin? And can you kind of just give an update on what it looks like right now?
Yeah, so they just went out there on Friday, had their, you know, first, I think, full practice out there on Saturday. They're going to be out there for over 2 weeks. I'm not exactly sure what day they come back. They will come back over weekends. You know, I know this Saturday they come back and practice at Nipper Stadium to give guys a chance to come back to campus and all that. But they love it. I mean, this is the 25th year that they've done it out there at Higher Ground. They really feel like it gives them an advantage. You know, if you look at the history of Cincinnati, I think they went to 1 bowl game before they started going to Higher Ground. And then since then, it's been like, you know, 18 or 19 bowl games in the past 25 years or something like that. So they love kind of being able to get out there and get away and have this team building experience. And honestly, they're going to need it this season because it's a huge year of transition for the team. Not only are they going to the Big 12 and a huge step up in competition, they also obviously have a first-year head coach in Scott Satterfield. They're also the only Big 12 team this season that has undergone a head coaching change. And with that comes, you know, a bunch of turnover in roster. They brought in, I think, 23 new players, whether incoming freshmen or via the transfer portal. And in some key positions, they have 1 returning starter on offense that's going to be back. So there's a lot of new with Cincinnati football right now. And I think going out to Higher Ground and maybe having a few weeks where you block out all the distractions, it's just football, it's just you there with the team. That's the biggest thing this group needs right now because there's a lot of transition and newness that's going on.
Is there anything you've heard or that has stuck out to you that makes you positive about the trajectory of this team right now?
I think the defense is going to be really good. You know, we talked about the offense only returning 1 starter. There's a bunch of stars back on the defense: Dante Corleone, Juwan Briggs, Deshaun Pace. And then they've gone out and added a few players that seem like they could be really good pieces via the transfer portal. Jordan Young, who came from Florida as a cornerback. You know, I'm not ready to call him Sauce Gardner, Kobe Bryant yet, but he looks like he could kind of be that next really good cornerback that Cincinnati needs, especially going into the Big 12. So defensively, you know, I expect them to be good this season, and that could really be, you know, the difference between having an encouraging year or a not encouraging year. You know, UC fans, if you go back to 2018 when Desmond Ridder was a redshirt freshman, you know, he was still kind of learning the ropes. That defense kept them in a lot of games and gave them a chance to win a lot of games. They ended up winning, I think, 11 that year. I don't think they're going to win 11 games in the Big 12 this season, but if that defense can kind of keep them in games and give the offense a chance to squeak out a few, close victories, then that could be the difference between a bowl-eligible season, an encouraging season, and then, maybe a full-on rebuild. So the defense, I think, will be the key to this team. And then at offense, it's, Emory Jones, the transfer quarterback. How quickly can he mesh with this revamped wide receiver room they have? How good can a newly built offensive line become? So it's almost like looking how good can the offense get, and then how great can the defense be. And those two variables, I think, are going to determine how fans feel about this team this season, while understanding that it's going to be an uphill climb in a lot of respects either way.
Yeah, the win total's set at 4.5 right now. I'm not asking you to tell people how to spend their money, but if you had a take on that, what would it be?
Yeah, if it's 4.5, I feel a little bit better about the over. I've seen 5.5 some places, and that's where I'm like, well, maybe 5 feels like maybe it's kind of right there. And so what? If you get 6 wins, you're bowl eligible. I think a bowl eligible Cincinnati Bearcats team this season is a win. In general, I think that's a successful season for them. And then if you're kind of towards the end of the season and fighting that 4.5, 5.5 win total, then I think that shows that there's some change to be made. If we're going into the last week of the season and the 4.5 is not hitting win or lose, then I think that's where you might have some disappointment as a fan.
All right, last question. Scott Satterfield coming over here from Louisville and taking over this program. I know, we've talked a lot in the last few months since he's been hired on this show that it wasn't exactly the name brand cachet of, going out and maybe getting a Deion Sanders, some big splash hire. But I never got the impression that Deion was even a realistic candidate in this coaching search with John Cunningham and the way he was, handling looking for a new coach at Cincinnati. Do you think now with Colorado joining the Big 12, do you think that maybe a few years down the line, Colorado and UC play each other and Deion Sanders is coaching against UC, that maybe there's a little what if there, or what do you think? What's your take on that?
Look, this is the case for Cincinnati. This is the case for all the other programs that made head coaching hires in this past, coaching carousel cycle. They're all going to be judged against Deion, probably, for good or for ill. So if Deion goes to Colorado and proves to, kind of be this masterstroke hire, whether, regardless of how long he then stays at Colorado, but if it goes there and works out, then Cincinnati fans and all the other, USF, Georgia Tech, all these other teams that might have had a chance to bring Deion in, that's what it's going to be viewed against, at least in some respects. For Cincinnati, though, and for Scott Satterfield, I'm sure they're not thinking about it. But yeah, if the Deion thing works, then a lot of teams are probably going to be like, man, maybe we should have taken a chance on it. And then on the other hand, if the Deion thing doesn't work or crashes and burns, then I think there's going to be a lot of administrators who are pointing at it and going like, this is why we didn't go after it. But it'll be interesting to see, the next 2-3 years, how that looks, and then maybe how some of those other fan bases feel about it.
All right, Justin, I really appreciate you taking the time this morning. We'll talk to you again sometime soon.
Thanks, Paul. Anytime.
All right, see you.